My name is Dale Edwards. I'm going to be taking you through today's webinar, and joining me to support in the questions and to help moderate at the end two senior colleagues, Sachin Das, and my colleague from the academic team, Chanda Katuria. Exciting afternoon ahead, and we're about 2 minutes over 2 o'clock. We currently expect to have about 1,475 teachers join us. So on that note, I think we've got a lot ahead, lots of exciting discussions today. And just to help keep this all in context, it's about helping improve teaching. It's not about trying to find fault in anything, but to have a progressive, cohesive, future-oriented, future-leaning discussion about what can we all do as teachers. So on that note, I think it's time to begin. So today, of course, we're looking at integrating 21st century life and transferable skills into the curriculums. And I think since we're all teachers over here, I wanted to be a little wishful and spur your imagination by asking you this question. Please feel free to use the chat. I will try and monitor it as much as I can, but my colleagues are also doing that. So what does this mean to you? What do the letters of the alphabet mean to you? Nice. Progress, colors, progression, communication, learning, the first step, and so on and so forth. Very nice. And now, just to add a little bit of measure to this, and now what do they mean to you? Yeah, I saw the word constraint over there. That's true. So this kind of sets into perspective. You know, as teachers, we constantly focus on the left because it's all about what we can do, how we can help, the world of imagination that we take children and young learners through. And then, of course, the measured reality of those percentages that keep hanging over our neck every now and then. So in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at all of these things, what the world regards and values, a little bit about skills, working with transferable skills, skills in the classroom, and of course, question and answer session. And if, of course, we have a little time, I'd like to also get into a case study, but I suspect that we may have to leave that for another session. So let's begin right at the very top. This is what we're looking at in our first section today. And so what does the world value and regard? And I think the answer to that is academic results, rightly, wrongly. Now, there was a time, perhaps 60s, 70s, 80s, when many of us were in school, this picture would ring true on the left. All right, we got help from our parents if we brought back an F grade. But now tables seem to be turned. Everybody's upset with us, no matter what the grade. And this kind of helps put things in perspective because on one hand, as teachers, we give it our best day in and day out. And sometimes we forget that the system, or rather the system forgets that we teach to be progressive. And in that regard, we start to feel the pressure a lot. And now don't get me wrong, sure, we're responsible for all our students, but what can we do to help better the entire learning process? Now, speaking of the result system, we are actually in the middle of academic results in India. Some boards were able to do it a little earlier, some are in the middle of doing it. And currently, this is pretty much what the results are going to look like. We will boast how many got 99% and above. Excuse me, needless to say, 90% is 50% and 100% is sometimes the new normal. And while all of this is great, and we feel really good about this, I also want to add a little bit of measure from what happens when our learners get into the real world. And here you can see that industry does not take the kind of shine towards them that we'd hope they would. I'm quite sure that when you look around, you see so many of our young graduates incapable of getting an opportunity either with an organization or to be able to start off on their own. And I think that missing link, all right, is where this afternoon's discussion can really come in and help. So this is our current situation sometimes, all right? And that missing link is really what we're talking about today, which is skills and 21st century skills. But to understand how we got here, I think we must first look back a little bit into the past to see what happened along the way. And for that, I'd like to point out and take you through a little bit of a story of how testing began. So the 1850s, 1870s, right up until the 1913 or early 19th century, early 20th century, my apologies, testing was kind of rigorous, authentic. It focused on the learner, and we used a metric known as psychometrics to see what your ability was. And then strangely in 1913, three gentlemen appeared for an English test based on psychometrics. And funnily enough, they failed. But this was also the time when the world was going through an industrial revolution. Everything from our population to mechanization to industrialization was powering on all fours. And hence, we needed to speed up the system. So we needed testing that could measure everybody fast. So hence, psychometrics went out, and as a result of which content came in. And this is kind of simple to understand because we design a test in this scenario where we're measuring facts. But as teachers, somewhere down, I think this settles with us, where we say, we know this for a fact, both as parents as well as teachers, that every child is different. So yet, how can we truly measure every child's difference when we give them one common test? And so this continued as a system for quite some time. And then somewhere in 1972, that changed. When the world kind of put the brakes on it and said, hey, we need to look back and see what are we really doing for our learners. And hence we need to now look at also not just what they know, but more importantly, what can they do? So with that hope, all right, from the 1970s, things started to change. All right, and it in fact began a little earlier, which I will talk about in a second. All right, but for us as teachers, day in and day out, we go into the class, we teach our young learners to learn at their own pace, their own style. We set goals for each of them individually to realize their potential. And then sadly, we come to the stage where we give them this test. So you see a lot of the formative parts that we do is very much already there. But we now need to add value to a system that can also help our young learners change and move around that curve. So moving on from there, I think it's important to, when we talk about standardized tests, it's important to see actually what happens with standardized testing. Now over here, many of you may know of what Pisa is. It's the Program for International Student Assessment. It's held, or the body that conducts it is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a member, 36-member European body that kind of helps students assess their skills in math, science, and reading. And they do this test every 3 years. Now, if you're looking for where India is on that map, you won't find it in the rankings. That's because in 2018, India was not a part of this test. India was a part of the test in 2009. And sadly, at that point in time, India ranked 72 out of 73 nations. The only country we seemed to be better than was Kyrgyzstan. Now, don't get me wrong. I know for a fact as a teacher that Indian children are very good with math and sciences, okay? It's the talk of our country. We have places in Kota and we have the IIMs and IITs that validate all of that. But as teachers, can the exceptional few be a reflection of the entire system? All right, I think you know in your classroom, okay, you have children who will always do well, okay? And then you have those who really need your help. Now, The ones who will do well, no matter what, will continue to do well. But as teachers, we go for what we call the lowest common minimum denominator, which is progress in all the learners across the board. So, by the way, India is taking part in the Pisa ratings in 2021. In fact, my colleague will put in a little bit of information in the chat, a couple of links to understand what Pisa is and the ratings and so on and so forth, and how it works. But when I spoke of change that happened, it actually happened quite some time back. And many of you as teachers would be very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. In the right-hand panel, I've kind of kept a little bit of information over there about what the taxonomy was all about. But essentially, it was geared towards learning of skills. And teachers could use content that is typically done in the classrooms, all right, as the vessel in which this learning could happen. So if you look at the progression from the bottom onwards, okay, you see a child over there begins to recall facts and basic concepts. And there are verbs that are used to define the stage. So the child can define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, and so on. And that is typically what we would call the lower order thinking skills, or the LOTS. All right. And a lot of schools do use this across the world, many of them within India, and certainly in the classroom and in teaching. All right. And then, of course, you see the trajectory that the learner takes from remembering to the understanding phase, and the verbs that are associated with what a learner can do at that stage are getting now progressively a little more complex, but also shows more reliance on what the learner can do. So typically the phases of apply and understand is what we would refer to as the middle order thinking skills. And the ability to analyze, evaluate, and create is what we would refer to as the higher order thinking skills, which a lot of schools give importance to. Now, this is all great, but the Bloom's taxonomy, by the way, has gone through a couple of revisions from initially coming out in 1956, the first year it was published. They've had some iterations, and the last one was in 2001, that they now, in addition to adding the cognitive domain or the knowledge-based domain, they've also added other realms in which learning can happen. So they've added the affective domain, and they've also added the psychomotor domain. So things are definitely there for us to make great progress with our learners. And interestingly, if you look at this, you realize that some of our biggest education boards in the country, the CBSE and the ICSE, all right, in a sign of times, are also changing. CBSE is introducing mandatory subjects like arts, all right, music, dance, visual arts, technology, theater. And the ICSE is even talking about doing something with communication skills, where they will teach you the essential elements of it. And I'm talking a little later about communication skills because I think that is one significant skill set that if a lot of people had it, it would make a very big difference to their learning, to their progress, academically, socially, and most importantly, professionally. And that, I think, is a huge one for all of us. We've got a huge workforce, all right? If we can impart a few key skills, it will make a really, really big difference to how well they will do. I also know that very often you may know of several people who perhaps had all the qualifications necessary to get a position, but then sadly missed out or was overlooked because they did not perhaps have a key skill like communication or some of the other skills that we're going to be discussing today. So this also has paved the way, by the way, for what we are beginning to see happen. For the longest time, there's a great emphasis always been on science, technology, engineering, and math. And that's great, okay? But times have changed. This century alone, we duplicate and we add 1 billion to more to our population every few years. So it's only normal that we also start to study people. And the subject that really deals with that are things like arts and the humanities and the behavioral sciences, all right? And if you really just pause for a moment and think about it, all right, so much of science, technology, engineering, and math, okay, the focus And if you look around the world today, all right, you sometimes will wonder, where did all that education go? All right, we're sometimes having discussions which are the most banal, inconsequential, that really reflect lower order thinking, things like race relations and whose is bigger, whose is better, and money, and so on and so forth. And sometimes as teachers, we, from day one, we're geared to kind of look beyond that. And now we also, and I know we will continue to do that, but the good news is that subjects like the arts and behavioral sciences and things like that are coming into play in a lot larger way, which sets up the discussion for what is going to happen with these young learners when they get into the next phase of their life, the workforce. So in continuation of what the world regards and values, thus far we're looking more at the academic system, but now let's look a little bit at what's happening in the workplace. As you can see, this is from the LinkedIn Global Talent Trends Survey, 2019. If you're asking why aren't I talking about 2020, I'll come to that in a second. But here, if you look at the third bar on the left, you can see that in India, all right, all working professionals and talent professionals feel that 95%, all right, the importance of communication skills, all right, and they feel the need for skills, soft skills. They use this word generally. We will also talk about that. So this is what already developing countries have felt. Now, if you look at the extreme right, the developed countries have already known this for a while, which is why in their strategy to place people and to work with the human talent pool, they've already factored this in. So the awareness now is not that high because the system has already begun to reflect that. But in a country like ours, we're definitely feeling this very much. In fact, if you go one further and you look at the 4 trends transforming the workplace in 2019, it was soft skills. And if you look to your right, you can see that 92% of people say that soft skills matter as much or more than hard skills. Now that's very interesting, all right? And if you look down, they'll say 89% say that bad hires typically lacked soft skills. And my colleague is putting in these reports for your reference to read in your convenience, all right? But this paves the way for a discussion of what the world is looking at, all right? And what we know to expect going forward. And this again, okay, we'll tell you the 4 top skills that everybody wants to have, whether you are an HR person or whether you are an executive yourself or whether you are involved in talent development, is these are the skills that everyone wants: leadership, communication, collaboration, and role-specific skills. Now, I said I would talk to you also about 2020's outlook, and this is what it is. Now, you can see the whole of 2020. By the way, this report comes out in January, all right? So this is even pre-COVID report. And it'll be very interesting to see what next year's report looks like, all right? But if you see over here, employee experience is placed right at the top. Okay, which means now companies are becoming a little far more receptive, and they realize that it's not just about employees working for us, all right? If we're going to demand the best out of them, it's what we need to also give back. And with that comes things like people analytics to assess how are we doing in our workplaces. And mind you, this has no standardized test. This is going to come down to your roles, your functions, your responsibilities, and all of those. So this is what we need to be looking at and talking about. The interesting one is the last one, is the multi-generational workforce. I know we often talk about, you know, the elder ones getting replaced by the younger ones, but you know the saying, old is gold, all right? There are certain things you just can't replace. And we are now seeing validation of this even more when you're seeing a multi-generational workforce. Like I said, all of this is still pre-COVID report. All right, can you imagine what will happen in next year's report? Now, moving forward, so we realize, okay, that when it comes to the demands of the world as far as assessing goes, okay, academia is like this. Learning is in one direction, testing is in another direction. And as you progress from that stage into the real world is also asking these questions. What do you know? Or rather, what can you do? And this sets the tone for today's discussion because it's all about what can you do. Now, just on a sidebar over here, I also want to share with you, because in that timeline that I shared earlier, I put 1877, and I did not talk about what happened that year. That was the year Trinity College London really started. And over the years, I think everybody knows that the value of our certificates is extremely immense, kind of opens doors. It's used in higher and further education. It's used as a proficiency claim. But more importantly, I want to share with you why it is that way. So this is a picture which you are familiar with if you were in our last webinar, all right? And you can see that if you look at this picture, the poor seal, fish, and penguin don't stand a chance in this test. Okay. But this is what teaches us also that when we as stakeholders, or all stakeholders across the ecosystem, from teachers to educationists to employers to people involved with society, we need a framework to analyze, critically evaluate, design, and develop tasks. So hence, you can't design one test or have one way of assessing for all of us. And as teachers, we know this. All right, in our classroom, we've got so many different children with so many different abilities. And sometimes you can see, I mean, you know that there are certainly some who will do very well, but you also feel very happy and proud for the ones who don't necessarily score the 90, but scored 60 as opposed to scoring perhaps 40, but more than that, knew the journey they went on to get it over there. So moving from there, in our philosophy of test taking, for us, we've always believed that the test taker needs to be at the center. Okay, and this should then be surrounded by a construct of what kind of resources is the learner being exposed to? What are the contextual parameters? Because it's all very well to learn something in an academic way, but we need to know in what context are you going to use it. Similarly, we must also be aware of what processes you are going to employ to be able to prove and to be able to show what you can do. And finally, of course, there should be some consequences to taking a test. It cannot be just an end in itself. And this is why the tests that we design always focus on these three things. All right. In one level, it marks achievement, but not in its isolation. We also give you a diagnostic to tell you that this is where you could perhaps have done a little bit better, or within this task, this is what we assessed. All right. And going forward, maybe you want to look at this. So it kind of measures achievement, it measures proficiency, and it measures it also gives you a diagnostic of how to improve and self-improve. Now, the other important thing of a good test is something like this. I think the image is kind of quite self-explanatory, and that is known as washback, all right? If we truly have a good test, then the test will influence what and how teachers teach and what and how students learn, all right? So this brings me to the end of kind of bringing you up to speed with what testing is and where the world is, both as regards academia, as well as regards the workplace, which now brings me to the next section where we're going to talk about skills, all right? And some of these skills in a little more detail. But let's start at the very beginning. So for the last 100 and odd years, we've been working with students and learners of all ages, not just children, but a lot of adult learners also take our assessments. And we've realized that there are 4 things that really students or learners need to succeed. They need confidence, all right? And I'm going to talk about confidence in a second, or rather a couple of seconds. But they also need language skills. And this is an interesting thing to look at. My colleagues in the earlier sessions, Joyce and Shoma, touched upon this. And in time to come, we will get far deeper into these talking points. But as a result of which, within the context of language, okay, we still need to be able to see it's not just in the context of grammar, vocabulary, and phonology, okay? We need to look at it also in other ways, like prosody. We need to look at a language not in an end as itself, but the purpose of language, all right, is also to be able to interact. So it has to be social linguistic. The concept of me speaking supposedly, let's say, a Queen's English is irrelevant in India. All right, I need to speak an English which my neighbor and my partner in society can understand. So so there are certain definitions which we also need to rework and relook at. And within that context, even with language, we need to also be able to have a discourse, all right, which means organize coherently, cohesion, all right, not just in writing, but also in speaking. All right, a lot of what we do in our education systems focus heavily on reading and writing. But, you know, you go in for a job interview, you're not going to get a chance to write your answer down. You need to be able to put forth all your ability to discuss, all right, with cohesion in the way in which you speak. And so, of course, with language also comes this strategic use of being able to use it for various other purposes. So now this is just a language skills that I'm talking about. And like I said, in future webinars, we will be exploring all of these in a lot more detail. But the other area that we need, and this is the big one, the focus area for today, is transferable skills. Now, there were so many places that one can look for this definition. And if you Google this term, all right, you will go to many, many ends. But I chose to pick up the one from a body that I thought truly represents humanity, which is UNICEF. And my colleague is actually putting this report in a chat, all right, I think she's just done that, which gives you this entire report. It's a framework on transferable skills. And we must understand, so firstly, it clears the myth that transferable skills are also known as life skills, socioeconomic skills, 21st century skills. Now, most importantly, it is the magic glue, okay? So if someone says transferable skills is expendable, no. It's the skill that's in the center of holding together your skills in numeracy and language, along with your job-specific hard skills, along with your digital skills. Okay, so transferable skills is this internal glue that is holding it all in, which is made up of a lot of human emotion and a lot of human cognitive processes to be able to hold it together. And it's very, very important for not just children and adolescents to become agile learners, but for some of us who are much older, right, to become adaptive learners. Okay, I think you'll remember this famous line from the Titanic when the young guy was looking out the bridge went and told the captain, I can see an iceberg over there. And the captain, instead of taking him up to check on it, says, you don't know the sea, my son. All right, for 35 years, I know that there will be no iceberg over there. So sometimes for a lot of us, we've got experience that we must also recognize that sometimes that experience may be working against us and we need to be adaptive learners. And I think transferable skills holds that solution to be able to help us evolve and navigate changing environments, be it because of socioeconomic conditions or because of health conditions or any condition for that matter. All right, the ability to be nimble, to adjust is really that whole cohesion of all the skills. I see someone in the chat said experience can make you short-sighted at times. Very true. It's absolutely very true. So I've chosen to talk about this from the UNICEF point of view, all right, and which is why I'm sharing with you the report. It makes for really interesting reading, and more importantly, it talks about countries like Africa and Asia, where our learners also need a lot of help, all right. Now, moving on from there, to understand what are these transferable skills, I've now sourced this information from the World Economic Forum. My colleague will post this report in also for you for additional reading. And it's the Future of Jobs report, which was published in Jan 2016. And essentially what they did over there was they went to the top hiring companies and they asked them, okay, so when you hire people, what are the skills that you look for in a learner or in someone who's going to join you? And they put out all these skills, complex problem solving, coordinating, blah, 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 blah. And then they said, what do you think things are going to be like in 2020? Now, if you notice, this is in 2015, they predicted this. But they said, well, we're not asking for anything new. We just want this. And this is what the workplace demands, all right? We're not asking that you change your content in the textbook every 5 years. We're asking, do that if it means, but can we well work towards these skills in the end? And these skills are remaining constant. And if you ask me, I think in this coronavirus lockdown, a lot of these skills have been called into play, or a lot of these skills are going to be, many of us have already developed them and are continuing to get better at it. All right. So Based on that, I want to finally talk about the last area of development, which is study strategies. All right. And again, my colleague will talk about this a little later, as she has already touched upon it in our last webinar, but in the future ones, we will talk about it. But this essentially is, how do we as learners process all that we are bombarded with? All right. From media to text to audiovisual media to opinions to factual documents to academic papers to excuse me, we must be able to still navigate through all of that with a sense of purpose. And this is where the study strategy skills come in. Now, to put this all in perspective, this is what we do, all right? So if I had to say, develop a pathway, and we do this with a lot of schools in India, is between the ages of 3 to 7, we work to help develop confidence, okay? Now, why at this age? And how will you do it at this age is the question. Well, in the obvious way, through something which is lighthearted, which does not require a child to learn ABCD, which does not require a child to necessarily worry about whether they can develop cursive writing, all right? But which just allows them to be who they are. And that is confidence, all right? And the reason why I talk about this here is because imagine this for a moment. You are a teacher. If you're in a private school, you are lucky. You have 20, maybe 40 kids in a class. But if you're in a government school, you have 70 and 80 children. All right. And normally what tends to happen is that when children are at this age, you probably kind of define them and say, okay, you're the singer and you are the dancer and you talk a lot. And we start to kind of label them in a nice way. We mean no harm. And every now and then, whenever there's any activity in the class, we call out to the child and say, come here, you're the dancer, you do this. All right. Now, think about it from the children's perspective who are not participating, or worse still, when you call the child the dancer, you did not do anything wrong. You did everything right. But the child who you did not address heard in his mind or her mind, I am not the dancer. I am not the singer. I am not the whatever. And over a period of time, starting from kindergarten right up till grade 10, they just keep hearing that they are not anything. All right. And if you want proof of all of this, just go back to your grade 10 class photograph, look at it. All right. And try and put names to the faces that you see, and try and remember those friends. And you'll remember, you'll figure out that you'll remember the naughtiest one, or the one that got suspended, the one that played football, all right, because of this kind of labeling, all right. Now, like I said, as teachers, we're not worried about the few. We're worried about the mass, all right. So if all of our kids are going to go through this, then we can do this. I can see someone over here talking about group work can be effective. That's right. So we do it through drama, all right? And we will talk about this going forward. But now at the age of 5, we then start to develop language skills. And specifically when I'm talking about language skills, I'm referring to speaking and listening. Again, normally 5, 6-year-old children in India are graduates in cursive writing. But is that really needed? All right? Instead, let them speak. Let them listen. Let them play. Okay. As they grow a little bit older, they then start to develop interests. Drama, singing, they have a favorite actor, their favorite song, God forbid their favorite YouTuber also sometimes. But in all of this, we can now use that as the vessel to develop transferable skills. And finally, of course, from the age of 12 onwards, we can start to develop study strategies. All right. So I'm going to now kind of move from this, all right. Maybe at some other future webinar, we can deep dive into all of this again. All right. And I want to now talk about the transferable skills. And specifically in this regard, I'm taking one heavy subject of communication skills. And my colleague will post this link to the syllabus in case you want to read it. And with this syllabus, I'm going to also try and show you how to marry the transferable skills that come out of this. So first, it starts with us needing to understand what skill do we want to develop, and then us understanding what is the meaning of that skill. So as you can see, very clear on the left-hand side, listing of the skill. On the right-hand side, meaning of the skill. So I've chosen 8 skills, as you can see. Okay. And in addition to these 8 skills, now I'm going to try and show you how to put it into a progression which demands both construct of a task and the learner's response to that. So for instance, in a grade initial, in our communication skills syllabus, we say that the outcome, the learning outcome of the learner should be, he or she should be able to participate in simple, informal conversational exchanges. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see what skill is being developed if a learner can learn this, all right? And similarly, they should be able to communicate prepared information clearly, okay? Prepared information, now please note over there, who prepares this? The learner, not learnt by heart. Something that the learner believes in. Similarly, when you look at the second point, describe and discuss an event, an object, a picture. What I'm highlighting over there in pink or bright magenta is the tasks that reflect the learner. Okay, so this is where you marry the task or the outcome with what the learner's context is. And when you do these two together, you start to develop what's happening in the third column, which is all those other skills. And progressively, if you look at grade 1 and grade 2, all right, it starts to get a little more complex, all right? We use words like with understanding, all right? We talk about mood, vocal skills, attitude. Remember, what is highlighted in bold and black is the task and the outcome. What is highlighted in magenta is the child's context or the learner's context. And what you get in the third column as a result of which are transferable skills. And I've done this also for a higher grade of grade 3 and grade 4 and 5. By the way, in case you're wondering whether these grades are the same like school grades, no, they aren't. Typically a grade 8 exam of Trinity is taken by about a 16 to 18-year-old. So if you work it backwards, a grade 1 typically would mean somewhere around maybe 7, 8, 9. All right. And again, we are not the ones who say that a child at this age should do this. We say, look at the learner's abilities. The test taker is important. If they can do it at an earlier age, sure, why not? If they need to do it at an older age, sure, why not too? All right. Learning is not defined necessarily by ages. It's defined more by outcomes. All right. So in that regard, it's completely flexible for you to interpret. Okay. Now, moving forward from here, I also want to share with you, how can we do this in the classroom? Okay, so maybe if you would like, we could do a separate session on communication skills, but I just wanted to talk about that in this context of transferable skills. And I still think that will be a very helpful session for a lot of India, particularly for a lot of adults. But I also now want to talk about what can we do in the classroom. All right, so this is kind of my last section. And I would like to get into it, spend a little bit of time over here, maybe about 10 minutes talking to you about all of these things. But first I want to explain this concept of micro-teaching, all right? It was founded in Stanford University, all right? It was actually used in the context of medicine and was used to train teachers. But it's been so revolutionary in the way it's been applied, okay, that you could use this anywhere, in any scenario that involves transference or teaching of skill. And my colleague will post you a link over here about micro-teaching so that you can Google it and read up on your own time. Okay, but essentially it takes the model of I demonstrate for you, you do it back for me in your context, in short bursts, videotaped or recorded, so that we can then discuss learnings from there. All right, and I can tell you a lot of companies in the world, particularly the professional public speaking companies, use this as a method. All right, but moving on from there, let's talk about the classroom. All right, building a communicative classroom. Now, the ones which are where the text is in blue, I'm going to be talking about it in a second. But if we want to start building communication skills and we want to start building transferable skills, it all has to start with the STT and the TTT. Do any of you know what that is? I'm sure you all know what this is. The STT is the student talk time, and the TTT is the teacher talk time in a class. And yes, absolutely, someone got it bang on. You're absolutely right. But now imagine what happens in our classrooms. Ideally, the student should be talking 80%, all right, and the teacher should be talking 20%. Why? Because the students need the practice. The students have to learn. But in a lot of our classrooms, it's not that way. It's probably 90% teacher talk time, 10% student talk time. And this is something to think about. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying change overnight. All I'm saying is this webinar, this discussion is stuff for you to ponder and for us to evaluate and say, yes, there was something interesting over here. I think I can try it. And this is what we would really love to hear from you, is that if you tell us, yes, you know what I heard in this webinar, I did try it and it worked very well, then we know that we're trying over that kind of eggs us on to do better for you. But it more importantly also tells us that, yes, someone's benefiting from this. All right. Now let's just talk a little bit about the other ones. Instructional approach. You know, maybe a couple of months ago, I wouldn't have to do a slide on this, but today I do, because today we work with technology. So on the left-hand side, you see you have a live class, okay? And then after that, you can give your learners maybe some post-lesson homework, which they could do in group work, all right? Maybe through technology of Zoom and breakout rooms and various other platforms also, not just Zoom. And you could also give them self-access materials, which is learner materials that they could go through, and maybe set another task for what they're supposed to do before they come in for their next lesson. So this becomes now very interesting. It uses versions of flipped classrooms. And I think with technology in the last couple of months, this has become a reality. It perhaps was not so maybe about 4 months ago, but now we are left with no option but to move. Which brings me to the image that you see on the right-hand side, which is synchronous learning that is done real time, all right, as a class in cohesion as a group. And then the asynchronous methods that you could use by perhaps sending emails or links like I'm doing in this webinar. And of course, running this through a module or a learning management software or a learning management system, things like Moodle and so on. And maybe in webinars to come, we'll even talk about marrying technology with teaching technology and teaching methodologies, all right? So let's talk a little bit about lesson planning. Now, you all know this, you're all teachers, so I shouldn't really, this is like preaching to the choir. There are 4 parts, okay? Presentation, practice, production, and personalization. And each one is actually self-explanatory. There are different models like ARC, which is authentic, restrictive, and clarificatory. Or there's the TTT model, which is teach, test, teach, or task, teach, task, test, task, whichever model you want to use. But I think it's important to imagine all of this in lesson planning to see that in the presentation part, that's where you as a teacher go in, give them that 5 or 10 minutes of instruction in that 20% teacher talk time. The learner then tries in their own way to apply what you've explained to them, all right? You then offer them feedback, and then they get into a freer practice form of production where they can now do it far more independently. And finally, of course, when it comes to the level of Eureka, we've conquered this, let's move on. Okay, so that's the personalization stage. Now, let's also talk a little bit about, in a communicative classroom, holding authority is very important because you don't want the class to gang up on you. All right, this happens to very early teachers, particularly if you have 4 and 5-year-olds. They gang up very fast, and before you know it, you're out of the class and they're running it. And I'm sure you're smiling to yourself because you're thinking of the memory, but this does happen. All right, so which is why when you are building a communicative class, holding that authority is very important because it's you who's kind of deciding or allowing them to take their steps, whether it's by deciding who does what or by you relinquishing the authority and saying, you do this now, I'm not going to do anything, all right? Or getting things done, or even holding their attention to pass on information. And similarly, of course, when you're working with people and when you're working with students, it's vitally important to understand that we don't want to be in that same situation where we only label the good ones. And we say, you're the singer, you're the dancer. No, spread the attention. Make sure all of them are learning from it, all right? Use your intuition to gauge their mood, okay? This is not a book that we're working on, so we cannot see, they cannot write their mood, but they can certainly express their mood far more effectively than they can ever be able to write it down. So we should be able to spot that. We should also be able to elicit honest feedback, all right? Both from them, from the class, as well as for us. And finally, of course, we should really, really, really be listening to our learners, okay? Now, which brings me to what can we do as far as classroom management? So as far as the teaching goes, increase the student talk time. As far as activities go, I think you can read that over there. All right, very simple instructions. All right. As far as lesson staging goes, all right, the PPPs, okay. As far as seating and group work, now this is interesting, and I want to just put this in the context of some of our classrooms in India. All right, most of our children do not go to private schools, and many of them sit in a bench or a class where the benches are fixed to the floor. So in a scenario like that, you need to keep in mind how they're going to interact. All right, and for that, I just want to go back to an earlier slide over here, which I kind of mentioned over here. If you can see this kind of seating, where this is actually how it is normally in a classroom. So here they can move from the waist up, turn around to interact across or here, and between themselves. Okay, so you don't have to get up and disrupt the class. Okay, you can do it just by leveraging just the upper half of the body work. All right, and when it comes to even designing activities, all right, I think you should keep in mind certain ones which require them to talk to another one, which is like mingling, or you assign some sort of group work or pair work, or where the student just does their own thing on their own. And of course, even the techniques, you can use gestures, you can use your voice, you can use silence. Silence speaks 1,000 words, they say. So that can be very helpful. And of course, you can use various other tools that you may have in the classroom. But most importantly, also learn how to monitor without interfering, all right? And then when you do get involved, it's to give feedback in a very holistic way. Now, which brings me to the last part, which is how to blend this with the curriculum. So this is what we've actually done in a lot of schools, is first, you need to choose the content, okay, that you want to work with. And I will talk about this in a second. The second thing you need to do is identify the transferable skills that you want to develop, okay. The third part is you need to devise and gamify it, plan your tasks, plan your activities. And the fourth one is where you model the exercises, where you show them what you want your learners to do. Then, of course, you get into the planning and execution stage, which is your lesson planning. And finally, where you can all sit around and talk about what were our learnings. Now, I want to take this one further and show you. So this is blending with the curriculum. I now want to show you how we can blend this methodology with the timetable. Excuse me. So let's imagine that there are a normal class, a normal school has 9 periods. And the ones that I've highlight in yellow are the ones that the school decided, fine, we're going to devote this period every week. Or rather, these are the subjects that we will work with to develop transferable skills. So in a second, to give you an example, week 1, the Hindi teacher, as you can see over here, adapted her, whatever content she was going to teach in the class, she hasn't changed that. She's going to meet the deadline of the curriculum head, of the academic head. She's going to continue with her portion. So portions are not coming to an end. She's going to continue with everything that the school is asked for. But she's going to adapt her lesson to be able to develop the communicative model. All right. And in week 2, excuse me, the physics teacher, all right, is going to do this with her class. And in week 3, math, week 4, sports, week 5, English, week 6, biology, chemistry, and value education. So in this way, you will see that all of them, all right, are now splitting this. This is not the responsibility of one teacher. Teaching skills is what all of us should be doing, all right? So it's not just the English teacher who needs to be doing this. Quite frankly, the skills apply no matter what the subject. So once a week, okay, you have a class, which is the communicative class, and that's a rolling class. So in week 1, it's in the Hindi period. In week 2, it's in the physics period, and so on. So finally, when you finish all these weeks, by week 10, you're back to the Hindi period, which means that the Hindi teacher, okay, does a lesson, and I'm down over here, every 9 weeks. And considering a school has only 36 working weeks in a year, okay, 32 to 36, depending on which school, we are talking about adapting just 4 class plans or 4 lesson plans of yours for the whole year. But this way, firstly, the whole skill set of the school, the learners, the children, all takes a step up, all right? The class is held once every week. Okay. Children are encouraged to develop their skills with no matter what content. And most importantly, overall, it will continue to involve a lot of participation. Please give me a second as I take a sip of water. So this brings me kind of to the end of what I wanted to share with you today. And I think it'll be exceedingly beneficial if I actually gave you some sort of plan or shared with you a plan. This is not mine, all right, for your homework and for your reflection. My colleague is going to put a link to this entire booklet available for you of how to integrate transferable skills in your classroom. This is from DePaul University in the US, all right. It's a great way to start if you're raring to go and you're saying, okay, how do I do this? So there are a couple of activities that you can do with your existing class, all right? Now, before I get into question and answer time, just to recap what we were discussing today. In part one, we looked at what the world regards and values. We discussed results, the history of testing, measuring academic progress. Most importantly, how can we look towards being transformative? In the second part, we looked at the different life skills, all right? The transferable skills that kind of are the magic glue that hold it all together. We specifically looked at the communication skills syllabus, which I think is a game changer for a lot of people. And I think is exceedingly helpful. And I'd like if you could really go through that. And maybe if you want, tell us that we could maybe do a session for you on that. And finally, of course, we discussed skills in the classroom. Now, on that note, I'm going to end this session over here. I will come back to the Q&A section in a second.